I bought it because Jimmy Pruitt told me I wouldn't. That's the honest version. The version I told my wife was that I saw potential in it, which is also true, but the primary motivating factor was Jimmy Pruitt saying, at a barbecue in Center, Texas, on a Saturday afternoon in April, that the truck in the Beaumont Brothers backlot had been sitting there since 1987 and that nobody in Shelby County was fool enough to buy it. I bought it the following Monday. The truck was a 1979 Kenworth W900, or it had been, once. What it was, by the time I drove out to the Beaumont property on County Road 138 and looked at it through a chain-link fence, was something that a 1979 Kenworth W900 becomes after 36 years of sitting in an East Texas field in the specific combination of humidity and pine pollen and seasonal flooding that Shelby County provides free of charge to any piece of machinery left unattended. The cab had gone from whatever color it had been originally, I couldn't tell, the oxidation was total, to the specific dark orange-brown of deep rust that has passed through every intermediate stage and arrived at something that looks almost deliberate, like a color choice. The windshield was gone on the passenger side. Something had nested in the engine compartment, more than once, based on the evidence. The tires were flat, in the way that tires go flat when they've been flat for a decade. Not deflated, dissolved, the rubber having surrendered to the East Texas climate sometime around 2001. Bobby Beaumont, the younger of the two brothers who owned the property, met me at the gate with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this conversation without expecting it to actually happen. He said, "You want to buy it?" I said, "What are you asking?" He said, $300, and you haul it off my property by the end of the month. I said, "I'll give you $250 and haul it off this week." Bobby Beaumont looked at the truck. He looked at me. He looked at the truck again, with the specific expression of a man recalculating whether he's underselling something to a fool or overselling it to a bigger fool. He said, $275. I said, "Done." I paid him in cash from the envelope I keep in my glove box for situations like this, which my wife calls the Bad Idea Fund, and which I call operational flexibility. We shook hands. Bobby Beaumont went back to his house with the look of a man who has gotten the better end of something. I stood by the fence and looked at the W900 for about 20 minutes. My name is Cal Tipton. I'm 54 years old. I've been in the freight business since I was 22, which started as driving and became, over time, owning, first one truck, then two, then the operation I run now out of Center, Texas, which has 8 trucks, 7 drivers, and contracts with 3 shippers in the East Texas timber and industrial corridor that have been renewing annually for long enough that I don't think about them as contracts anymore, just as relationships that produce paperwork at intervals. I still drive 1 run a week, sometimes 2, because the driving keeps me honest in the way that my father always said it would. You can't manage drivers correctly if you've forgotten what it feels like to be one. Let me tell you about those years, because they're the years that made the discovery of the W900 possible, in the sense I mean. I started driving at 22 because my father handed me a set of keys and said, "You want to learn this business? You start here. Not in the office. Here. The truck." He didn't coddle the transition. He gave me a route and a window and the expectation that I would meet both. And when I didn't meet them correctly on the first run, he told me specifically, and without anger, what I'd done wrong and what I needed to do differently. That's how he taught, and it's how I've tried to teach the drivers who've worked for me, with mixed results, because the combination of specific and without anger is harder than it sounds. I drove for 6 years before I bought my first truck. 6 years of running my father's routes on my father's equipment, learning the East Texas corridors the way he'd learned them before me. The timber runs to Houston, the industrial freight to Beaumont and Port Arthur, the occasional long haul west toward San Antonio or north toward Dallas when a contract required it. East Texas freight in the early 1990s was not glamorous work. The roads were still in the generation before the interstate upgrades. The shippers were still running on the handshake economy that my father had built his business in, and the trucks were what they were, maintained correctly but not new, the kind of equipment that rewards attention and punishes neglect. I paid attention. The trucks mostly didn't punish me. The first truck I bought was a 1991 Kenworth T600 that I found through a driver who was retiring out of Lufkin, not a W900. I'd been around W900s my whole life, my father's original trucks before he transitioned the fleet, and I had complicated feelings about them that I couldn't have articulated at 28 and that I understand better now, which is that some equipment carries more personal history than professional history, and the two don't always want to share space. The T600 was clean and practical and had no weight attached to it beyond its actual weight, which was exactly what I needed for a first truck. I drove the T600 for 2 years as an owner-operator before the second truck came and the second driver, and the growth that changes a driving operation into a management operation, whether you want it to or not. My father watched this process from the office with the specific patience of a man who has seen it happen and knows which mistakes are instructive and which are simply expensive. He let me make most of the instructive ones. He intervened on the expensive ones, sometimes in time and sometimes not quite. The instruction I got from those years is the instruction that I now try to give to drivers who come to me. The road teaches you what the classroom doesn't, and what it teaches you is not a list of facts, but a way of seeing. You start seeing the road as a system, then as a set of relationships, then as something that has its own logic, and that rewards people who learn that logic, and disciplines people who assume they already know it. My father had been seeing it that way for 30 years when I started. I've been seeing it that way for 32. The learning doesn't stop. He is the reason I still drive 1 run a week when 8 trucks and 7 drivers would justify full-time management. He told me, "The day you stop driving is the day you stop understanding what your drivers are doing. And the day you stop understanding is the day you start making decisions that are technically correct and operationally wrong." I've tested that proposition by watching other operations go wrong in exactly that way, and I've concluded that he was right. He was right about a lot of things. The box in the W900 contained some of what he was right about and some of what he didn't get right, and the combination of the two is what a life actually is. Now let me go back to Delbert and the assessment, because I skipped over the middle of it, and the middle has things worth knowing. The 11 days of the assessment were not 11 days of waiting. Delbert called me twice in that period with updates, not about the mechanical condition, which required time to evaluate properly, but about smaller things he'd found in the process of taking the truck apart to the degree that assessment requires. A side compartment that had been welded shut at some point and that contained nothing of interest when he cut it open. Tools, a set of wrenches in a canvas roll that had fused together with rust into a single object, and a CB radio that had been mounted and then removed and stored, and that was 40 years obsolete, but structurally intact. Delbert put these things aside in case they were useful. They weren't. He found the frame's condition in stages over the first week. "Good frame," he told me on day 4. "Better than it looks from outside," which in a truck that looks the way this one looks is significant. He was cautious about it because the external condition had set low expectations and he didn't want to overcorrect. By day 8, he was confident. The frame was the best part of the truck, the foundation that made the rest of the conversation worth having. The engine conversation happened on day 6. He called me at 7 in the morning. Delbert starts early, and said, "The engine is done." Not done as in finished, done as in it has been host to multiple generations of wildlife and at least one significant water intrusion event, and the block has cracked in 2 places that I can see and probably more that I can't. I said, "Replacement?" He said, "Replacement." I said, "What's available?" He walked me through 3 options over the following 2 days. A rebuilt ISX from a truck that had been totaled, a remanufactured unit from a supplier in Houston he trusted, or a complete period-correct rebuild that would cost twice either of the others and would produce an engine that was arguably more correct for the truck. I said, "Give me the cost on all 3, and I'll decide when I know more about the rest of it." The conversation about the cab happened on day 8. He'd had it stripped to the point where the structure was visible and the surface deterioration was separated from the substrate, and what he'd found was what he'd suspected. Cosmetic rust, on top of sound metal in most places. Actual metal loss in 3 specific areas that would require patchwork, and the cab structure intact in the way that matters, which is the floor pan and the A-pillars and the door frames. He said, "It'll be a project." I said, "Most things worth doing are." The conversation about the sleeper happened on day 9, which is when he found the panel. He called at mid-morning. He said, "There's something you should come see." Not alarmed. Delbert doesn't alarm. It's not his register. Just, there's something. I drove over on my lunch break. He showed me the panel. We stood there together and looked at it for a while. The construction adhesive was dried to the color of old mustard and had been applied carefully, which is the word I keep coming back to. Carefully, not hastily, not in a hurry. Someone had taken the time to do this correctly, to make sure the seal would hold, to make sure whatever was behind it stayed protected. Delbert said, "Do you know whose truck this was originally?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Do you want to know before we open it?" I thought about that. I said, "No. Open it." He handed me the chisels. The opening took 30 minutes, which I described earlier, but I want to add one thing I didn't describe. The sound the panel made when it finally released. It wasn't dramatic, not a crack or a snap, more of a sigh, the specific sound of pressure equilibrating across 36 years. The air that came out of the space behind the panel was stale in the way that enclosed spaces go stale, with the particular quality of something that has been sealed long enough that what it smells like now is different from what it smelled like when it was sealed. Old wood, something faintly chemical that I think was the oilcloth, and underneath both of those, something I can only describe as the smell of intention, the smell of a space that was prepared rather than merely closed. The box was in the center of the storage space, which meant it had been placed there. Not wedged in, not shoved. Placed with the front face of the box facing the panel so that the name carved on the lid would be the first thing visible when the panel came off. Thomas Cal Tipton. My father had placed his own name facing outward, toward anyone who would eventually open the panel, which means he expected someone to open the panel, which means he expected the truck to be found and examined, which means 36 years in Bobby Beaumont's field was either a longer wait than he'd expected or exactly as long as he'd thought it needed to be. I don't know which. I may never know which. Delbert stepped back without being asked. I lifted the box out. I set it on the floor of the shop. I looked at my father's name for a long time before I opened it. What I knew that morning was that Jimmy Pruitt had told me I wouldn't buy it, and that I had bought it, and that the buying of it was going to require me to solve a series of practical problems: transportation, storage, eventual restoration, or disposal, that I hadn't fully thought through before handing Bobby Beaumont $275. That's how most of the interesting things in my life have started. The thinking comes second. If you've ever bought something you had no business buying because someone told you that you wouldn't, subscribe before I tell you what was in that truck. Because the practical problems were the easy part, and what made this particular bad decision into something else entirely wasn't the rust, or the missing windshield, or the condition of the engine compartment. It was what was in the sleeper cab, behind a panel that had been sealed shut with what looked like construction adhesive sometime before the Clinton administration. Let me tell you about the truck first. What I mean by that is, let me tell you what I was actually looking at, beyond the rust and the deterioration, because understanding what the W900 was before it became what it was requires knowing something about 1979 Kenworths and something about what a truck like that meant to a man who drove in East Texas in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The 1979 W900 was the truck that drivers wanted. Not needed, wanted, which is a different category. It was the peak of the classic Kenworth aesthetic. The long hood, the set-back front axle, the chrome everywhere that chrome could be placed, the cab that sat high enough that you saw the road from an angle that communicated something about your position relative to everything else on it. It was the truck that appeared on mud flaps and belt buckles, and the back windows of pickups driven by men who aspired to it. If you drove one in 1979 in Texas, you had arrived at something. The one in Bobby Beaumont's field had arrived at something different. I had it towed to a shop in Center, a man named Delbert Hooks, who'd been working on trucks since before I had a license and who received the W900 with the specific expression of a man being handed a puzzle that might not have all its pieces. He said, "What do you want me to do with it?" I said, "Tell me what's there and what it would take." He said, "That's going to take a week just for the assessment." I said, "Take 2. The assessment took 11 days. Delbert called me on a Thursday evening and said, "You want the good news or the news?" I said, "There's no bad news?" He said, "There's news. Come look." I drove to Delbert's shop the following morning. The W900 was on a lift, or as much of it as could be put on a lift, which was the front end and part of the frame, the rest supported on stands. Delbert walked me through it with the patience of a man who has spent a career translating mechanical reality to owners who want a different mechanical reality than the one they have. The frame was solid. That was the first thing he showed me, took me underneath, and walked the rails with a flashlight, pointing out where the rust was surface and where the metal was intact. For a truck that had been sitting in an East Texas field for 36 years, the frame was better than it had any right to be, which Delbert attributed to the specific grade of steel that Kenworth used in 1979, and to the fact that the field it had been sitting in was higher ground than most of the surrounding area, which meant it hadn't been submerged in the seasonal flooding as much as the visual conditions suggested. The engine was not going to be restored. It had been colonized by things that had no business being in an engine block, and some of those things had been there long enough to become permanent. The engine was a loss. A replacement would be required if the truck was going to run. The transmission was better, salvageable with work. The rear axles were solid under the rust. The suspension was a project. The cab itself, the thing I was going to have to make a decision about, was structurally intact. The rust was cosmetic in most places, which sounds absurd for a truck that looked the way this one looked, but Delbert showed me where the cab skin had protected the underlying metal and where the cab over-frame construction had held. Replace the glass, address the rust, strip and repaint. The cab was savable. I stood in Delbert's shop and looked at the W900 and did the math that you do when you're a man who has bought a rusted truck for $275 on a bet. Delbert said, "It's going to cost you." I said, "I know." He said, "More than it's worth on the open market." I said, "I know that too." He looked at me with the expression of a man who understands that the math isn't the point. He said, "There's one more thing." He walked me to the driver's side of the cab. The door opened, reluctantly, the hinges having opinions about being asked to move after 36 years. But it opened. He pointed to the back of the sleeper cab, to the panel that separated the sleeping area from the storage space behind it. The panel had been sealed. Not taped, sealed, with a bead of construction adhesive that had hardened into something permanent, running around the perimeter of the panel on all 4 sides. Someone had, at some point, deliberately sealed whatever was behind that panel and then apparently abandoned the truck. Delbert said, "I didn't open it. Figured you'd want to be here." I looked at the panel for a while. Then I said, "You got a pry bar?" The adhesive had been there long enough that removing it took 30 minutes, and the cooperation of both of us, and the sacrifice of one of Delbert's better chisels. The panel came loose in stages, a corner, then a side, then the whole thing releasing with a sound that had 36 years of sealed air pressure behind it. What was behind it was not what I expected. I want to be honest about what I expected, because expectations are part of the story. I expected nothing, literally nothing of interest, the natural contents of a storage space that had been sealed before Ronald Reagan's second term and left to whatever the East Texas climate had done to it. Or I expected something embarrassing, the kind of thing a man seals away and abandons along with the truck, something that would make a good story, and nothing more. What I found was a wooden box. Not a crate, a box, the kind that's made by someone who knows how to work wood, with dovetail joints and a lid that fit well enough that the inside had stayed drier than it had any right to. About the size of a large toolbox. Heavy. Wrapped on the outside in an oilcloth that had preserved the wood beneath it from the worst of the moisture. I lifted it out. Delbert stepped back without being asked, because Delbert is the kind of man who understands when something shifts from mechanical to personal. I set the box on the shop floor, and I looked at it. On the lid, carved into the wood in letters that someone had taken time with, was a name. The name was Thomas Cal Tipton, my father's name. I want to tell you who my father was, because he's the person this story is actually about, and because what was in that box only makes sense against the context of the man who put it there. Thomas Cal Tipton, Tom to everyone, TC to the 3 or 4 people who'd known him since boyhood, had been a driver his entire working life. He started in the late 1950s, running East Texas timber freight on roads that weren't always paved, for outfits that operated on handshakes and the understanding that reliable men were worth keeping. He drove for 31 years, through the evolution of the industry, from those handshake operations to the CB radio era to the deregulation of the 1980s, and he drove every year of it with the specific competence of a man who has made his peace with his work, and his work has made its peace with him. He was not a man who talked much about the past. This is common enough in men of his generation and background that it doesn't require particular explanation, but I want to note it specifically because it's relevant to the box. What I knew about my father's early driving years came from other people, other drivers he'd worked with, my mother's recollections, the occasional fragment he'd let slip in an unguarded moment. The years before my mother, before me, before the operation we built together, those years were in a drawer he kept closed. He died in 2019. Not suddenly, he'd been declining for 2 years, the specific long decline that gives you time to say what needs saying, and that requires you to decide what needs saying and what doesn't. We had good years at the end. He came into the office 2 or 3 times a week until 6 months before the end, and we'd have coffee, and he'd look at the route maps and the schedule, and he'd ask the questions he'd been asking for 30 years, and I'd answer them, and the familiarity of it was its own kind of comfort. He never mentioned the W900. I want to be clear about that, because it's the thing that got to me most, sitting on the floor of Delbert's shop with a wooden box in my hands that had my father's name on the lid. Not Thomas Tipton, not T.C. Tipton. Thomas Cal Tipton, the full name, the name he'd given me for my middle name, which I'd resented as a child and had come to understand as the particular inheritance it was as I got older. He'd put his full name on that box, in a truck that had been sitting in Bobby Beaumont's field since 1987, 2 years before I started driving, 32 years before he died. He'd had 32 years to tell me about it. He hadn't. I opened the box with Delbert's chisels and with the patience that the lid required. The fit had been good enough that it wanted persuading rather than forcing, which meant the person who'd made it had done it correctly. The lid came up with the specific resistance of something that has been closed for a long time and then gives. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth and arranged with the care of someone who expected them to be there for a while, were 3 things. The first was a logbook. Not the standard government issue log that drivers were required to keep. A personal log, a journal in the proper sense, in my father's handwriting. Hardcover, cloth-bound, the kind that costs something and is bought with the intention of using it seriously. Dated entries from 1978 to 1987. 9 years of my father's early driving life, the years he never talked about, the years in the drawer. The second was a photograph. 3 people, outdoors, somewhere that I recognized after a moment as the Sabine River bottom in East Texas, the specific quality of light that comes through the pine canopy down there. My father, young, late 20s, early 30s, before I knew his face at that age, standing with a woman I didn't recognize and a child who was maybe 3 years old. The woman had her arm around my father. The child was looking at the camera with the specific directness of a very small person who doesn't yet know that looking at cameras is a social act. My father was smiling in a way I'd never seen him smile in any photograph I had of him. The third was a letter, sealed in an envelope that had held, the oilcloth having done its job, with my father's handwriting on the front. Not a name. 2 words. For Cal. I sat on the floor of Delbert Hooks's shop in Center, Texas, with that envelope in my hands for a long time. Delbert had gone to the other end of the shop. He was making noise with something. Not doing anything in particular, I could tell, just making the noise that gives a man in a shop something to do when he needs to be somewhere else without leaving. I've liked Delbert Hooks for 20 years, and I liked him more in that moment than I'd ever liked him before. I opened the letter. I'm not going to tell you everything that was in it, because some of it isn't mine to put in a public record, and some of it is still in the process of becoming something I fully understand, and the process isn't finished. What I'll tell you is the shape of it. My father, in the years between 1978 and 1984, had been a different version of himself than the version I knew. Not worse, different, younger, which sounds obvious. But what I mean is younger in the specific sense of not yet having the shape that the years give you, the shape that becomes your character once it's been pressed on long enough. He'd been in a situation in those years, a relationship, a life, a set of circumstances that he'd left, and the leaving had been the decision that made the rest of his life possible, and the rest of his life was my mother and me, and the operation we built together. The woman in the photograph was part of the situation he'd left. The child was part of it too. I'm going to let that sit there without explaining it further, because the explaining is still happening in ways that I'm not ready to make public. What I'll say is that the letter told me why he'd sealed the box and left it in the truck, and why he'd never told me about the truck, and why the truck had ended up in Bobby Beaumont's field, and why he'd had 32 years to tell me, and hadn't. The letter told me that some things are sealed not because they're shameful, but because the opening of them requires a moment that the person doing the sealing can't predict in advance, and that by the time the moment arrives, it's sometimes too late to be the one who does the opening. He'd hoped I'd find it. That's what the letter said, near the end. He'd hoped I'd find it after he was gone, because finding it after was easier than receiving it before. Easier for him, and possibly easier for me, though he acknowledged he might be wrong about that, and that wrong was a possibility he'd accepted. He said, I left it in the truck because the truck was where I understood myself the best, and the things I didn't understand about myself needed to stay where they had the best chance of being found by someone who'd understand them. He'd known, when he sealed the box, that the truck would eventually end up somewhere. He hadn't known it would be a Beaumont field for 36 years. He'd trusted the truck with it because drivers trust trucks in ways they don't always trust people, and the W900 had been his truck when those years happened and when those years ended, and it was the right container. I drove home that afternoon with the box on the passenger seat of my truck, the current one, a Peterbilt 579 that I've had for 4 years, and that is not a sentimental object the way the W900 was, and that is exactly the right tool for the work I do. The box sat on the passenger seat, and I drove the county roads through the East Texas pines in the specific afternoon light that East Texas gets in April, which is green and filtered and damp and smells like the beginning of summer, and I thought about my father with the specific quality of thinking you do about someone when you've just discovered a room in them you didn't know was there. Not betrayed, not angry, something more complicated than either. The specific recalibration of a 54-year-old man who has been carrying a version of his father for years and who has just been handed a different version, older and more complete, and requiring some revision of what he thought he knew. I want to be honest about the drive home, because the drive home is where the first version of the decision happened, not the final decision, which is still in process, but the first orientation toward it. I've driven these county roads my whole life. CR 138, where the Beaumont property is. CR 125, which cuts back towards Center through the pines. FM 139, which runs alongside the Sabine for a stretch before turning inland. I know these roads the way I know my own hands. Not consciously, just in the body, in the way that familiar routes become part of your navigation without requiring attention. I drove them on autopilot that afternoon, which left my mind free to do what it was going to do regardless. I thought about the photograph, the woman, the child. The letter had given me names. What it had not given me, what my father had deliberately not given me, I think, was information about where those names were now. He'd given me the history. He'd given me the context. He'd explained, in the careful language of a man who has spent years choosing how to say something, what the situation had been and what the leaving had cost, and why the leaving had been the decision that made the rest possible. He had not told me whether the child was findable, whether the woman was alive, whether finding either of them would serve anything beyond satisfying a curiosity that he couldn't have known I'd have. He left that open, deliberately. I understood, driving home on FM 139 with the Sabine visible through the pines on my left and the box on my passenger seat, that the openness was the point. He'd given me the history because he thought I had a right to it. He'd left the decision open because the decision was mine to make, not his, and he'd understood that making it for me would have been its own kind of wrong. My father had been a man who understood that some things belong to the person they affect more than to the person who caused them. The history was his. What I did with it was mine. I'm still figuring out what I'm going to do with it. The drive home took 40 minutes. I pulled into the driveway, and Karen was at the kitchen window. She'd heard the truck. She knows the sound of it. And she watched me come in with the box, and she didn't say anything, which was correct. I set the box on the kitchen counter. She looked at it. She looked at me. I said, "There's a photograph inside. I need to tell you about it before you see it." She said, "Okay." I told her. All of it. The woman, the child, the letter, what my father had said and what he'd left unsaid. She listened the way she listens, completely. And when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The child would be in their mid-40s now." I said, "Yes." She said, "Same age as you, roughly." I said, "Roughly." She looked at me with the specific expression that 26 years produces in a person looking at their spouse. Not the expression of evaluation, but the expression of someone who already knows what they're looking at and is checking that what they know is still accurate. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "I'll make dinner." We ate dinner and talked about other things. The operation, a scheduling issue with one of the drivers, the summer plans that we'd been putting off finalizing. The box sat on the counter while we ate, not demanding anything, not in the way, just present the way a new fact is present once it's been introduced into the house of what you know. After dinner, I moved it to the shelf in my office. That's where it is now. That's where it's been since April. I'm 54 years old, and I have my father's answer to most questions, which is that the answer is probably both, and I have the East Texas roads and 8 trucks and 7 drivers and a wife who makes dinner when it matters, and a friend named Jimmy Pruitt, who has known me for 43 years and who will be the first call when I know what the answer is. I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. A good truck tells you the truth. She answered, and I said, "You remember the truck I bought on the bet?" She said, "The terrible idea, yes." I said, "There was something in it." She was quiet for a moment. She knows me well enough to read the quality of a sentence. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think so. I'll tell you when I get home." She said, "I'll make dinner." That's my wife. Not, "What was it?" Not, "Tell me now." I'll make dinner, because she understands that some things need a kitchen table and not a phone call. The W900 is still in Delbert's shop. I haven't made a decision about it. Delbert hasn't pushed. He's given me the space that the situation deserves and has been patient in the way that Delbert is patient, which is completely and without comment. My options are what they've been since April. Restore it, which will cost more than it's worth, and which is not the point. Sell it, which feels wrong in a way I can't fully articulate. Or do what my father did and keep it as the container of something that needs to stay somewhere specific until the moment for it to move is clearer. I haven't decided. What I have done is read the logbook. All 9 years of it. The 1978 entries first, which are the most careful, the handwriting of a man who is writing seriously and somewhat self-consciously, and then the later entries, which are looser, less careful, the handwriting of someone who has stopped writing for an imagined audience and is writing for himself. The routes, the loads, the weather, the road conditions, the names of dispatchers and dock workers and other drivers, the observations that a man makes when he's been alone on a road for long enough that his mind produces things he wouldn't say in company. My father had opinions about the road. Strong, specific opinions, the kind that develop in a man who has been paying attention to one thing for a long time. He wrote about the 1979 W900 with the particular affection that I recognize from my own relationship with equipment I've owned and understood. Not sentimentality, but the specific appreciation of a tool that performs correctly and that repays attention with reliability. He wrote, "A good truck tells you the truth. Not what you want to hear, the truth. The road tells you the truth too, if you listen. Most men don't listen. They hear what they expect to hear, and they call it the road talking." I've been driving for 32 years, and I've thought about what he wrote in that logbook more in the 4 months since I read it than I've thought about anything else in that time. Not because it's profound. It's not, particularly. It's the observation of a man on a road with a notebook and enough time to think. But it's his voice, the voice I knew, the voice that had 32 years to say this to me directly, and chose instead to seal it in a box, in a truck in a field in Shelby County, Texas, and wait for me to find it. A good truck tells you the truth. I bought a rusted 1979 Kenworth W900 for $275 because Jimmy Pruitt told me I wouldn't. The truck told me the truth. My father had put the truth in there himself, which is either the most trusting thing he ever did or the most complicated, and I haven't finished deciding which. Jimmy Pruitt, when I told him what I'd found, was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So was it a good bet?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That's probably the right answer." I said, "My father would have agreed with you. The East Texas pines are doing what East Texas pines do in August, holding the heat in the canopy, making the roads between them green and dark and cool in the shade, and suddenly white when you come out into a clearing. I've been driving these roads my whole life, and I've been seeing them differently since April, the way you see things differently when the person who showed them to you has shown you one more thing than you expected. The W900 is in Delbert's shop. The box is on the shelf in my office, next to the route maps and the inspection logs and the things that are the current work. The logbook is beside it. The photograph is beside the logbook, in a frame I bought at a hardware store in Center, because the hardware store was where I was when I decided it needed a frame. The letter is in the box, refolded the way my father left it. I haven't decided about the truck, but I'm going to decide. If you stayed with me all the way through Shelby County, thank you. Drop a comment. If you found something like this in a truck you bought, would you want to know? I've been asking myself that question since April, and the answer keeps changing. Subscribe before you go. The next story is a different road, a different driver, a different kind of thing found in an unexpected place. The cab is always the same size. What's inside it is always someone's truth. Roll safe. Listen to what the road tells you. I've been telling this story in the order that made the discovery land correctly, which meant moving through it fast and arriving at the box with the right momentum. But there's context I skipped that matters, and I want to go back and fill it in, because a story about finding your father in a rusted truck requires you to understand who both people were before they ended up in that situation. Let me start with the aposta, the bet, and what it actually was, because calling it a bet makes it sound more spontaneous than it was. Jimmy Pruitt has been my closest friend since we were 11 years old, which is 43 years, which is longer than either of our marriages and longer than most of the trucks either of us has owned. He runs a construction business out of Center, not the freight side, the building side, the kind of work that produces the loads that I then move. We have been in a symbiotic professional relationship for 22 years and a friendship for 43, and the combination of those two things produces a specific dynamic that our wives have described as enabling and that we have described as operational synergy. The barbecue where the W900 came up was Jimmy's annual April thing. He does it every year, in the same backyard, with the same guest list that has evolved over 20 years as people have come and gone from Center. It's the kind of event that has a character now, that people expect things from, that has its own history. The W900 came up because someone who knew the Beaumont brothers mentioned that they'd been talking about clearing the backlot and that the truck was going to have to go somewhere. Jimmy said, "Nobody's buying that truck." He wasn't talking to me specifically. He was talking to the group, to the 4 or 5 of us standing near the grill with our drinks, making the kind of conversation that a Saturday afternoon in April produces. He was stating what he took to be an obvious fact. The W900 was too far gone, too much work, too much money for not enough truck. I didn't say anything immediately. I let it sit. But Jimmy Pruitt has known me for 43 years, and he read my silence correctly, and he said, setting his drink down and looking at me, "Cal, no." I said, "I didn't say anything." He said, "You've got the face." My wife, who was standing nearby, said, "What face?" Jimmy said, "The face he gets when he's about to do something that's going to cost us both." I said, "I'm just thinking." By Monday morning, I was at Bobby Beaumont's gate. Now let me tell you more about my father, because the story requires it, and because I've been circling it, and the time for circling is done. Thomas Cal Tipton started driving in 1958, which puts him on the East Texas roads in the era before the interstate system was complete, when US 59 and US 96 and the state highways were the freight corridors, and the trucks that ran them were the ones that had been built for a road environment that asked different things than the modern highway asks. He drove for 6 different outfits in his first decade, not because he was unreliable, but because the industry in East Texas in the early 1960s had a specific instability, small operations that grew and contracted and sometimes folded with the timber market, and a driver had to move when the work moved. He found stability in the early 1970s with a Lufkin-based outfit called Garrison Transport, named for the town, not for a person, that ran timber products from the East Texas mills to Houston and Dallas, and points east. He drove for Garrison for 11 years, which in the freight industry of that era was a long tenure, long enough to have routes that were his by custom even when they weren't his by contract, long enough to know every dispatcher and dock worker and shipper on the corridor, well enough to be on first-name terms without effort. The 1979 W900 was a Garrison truck at first. My father drove it as a company truck for 2 years, before Garrison went through a reorganization in 1981 and sold off part of its fleet. My father bought the W900 in that sale. I know this from the logbook, from the entry dated March 14, 1981, which reads, "Bought the truck today. For $200, which is $200 more than I wanted to pay, and $1,000 less than it's worth. Drove her home. The steering pulls left, which I knew, and Garrison knew, and we both knew, the other knew. We'll have it corrected by Friday." The steering pull corrected by Friday. I love that sentence. I love the precision of it, the no-nonsense accounting of a problem and its resolution, the confidence that it will be corrected by a specific date. That's my father's voice in a sentence. That's the man I knew. He drove that truck, his truck, titled in his name with the steering pull corrected, for 6 years, 1981 to 1987. The logbook covers that period and more, going back to 1978 when he started keeping it, 2 years before he bought the W900. Reading it is reading the development of a man through the medium he knew best, which is the road, and the specific transformations that the road produces when you pay attention to it. He wrote about loads, their weight, their character, the specific challenges of different types of freight. He wrote about roads, the sections that had improved and the sections that had gotten worse, and the politics of infrastructure that determined which was which. He wrote about weather with the attention of a man whose livelihood depends on understanding it accurately. He wrote about other drivers with the mix of generosity and precision that the road produces in people who've been on it long enough. This is a good driver. This one cuts corners on the grades. This one parks in 2 spaces at the Flying J and has been told about it and doesn't change. I want to give you some of what the logbook actually contains, because I've been describing it in summary, and the summary doesn't do it justice. An entry from March 1979, before he bought the W900, ran the Garrison truck to Houston today, the 389 that needs the clutch adjusted and that I have told Roy about 3 times, and that Roy has entered in the maintenance log, and that has not been addressed. The clutch will go on a grade before it goes in the yard. I have told Roy this. I am noting it here, so that when it happens, I will be able to say, "I told you so," which will not help the situation, but which will be accurate. He was right. There's an entry 6 weeks later. Brief. Clutch went on the Livingston grade. Roy is adjusting the maintenance schedule. An entry from 1981, the week he bought the W900. She rides different from the Garrison trucks. Higher, more direct, the road comes up through the wheel in a way that requires more attention, or rewards more attention. I'm not sure which yet. The answer to that question is probably both. The answer to most questions about trucks is probably both. An entry from 1983, a long one, unusually long, that I had to read twice to understand what he was working through. There are men who drive because they have to, and men who drive because it suits them, and men who drive because it is the only way they know to be alone, in a way that isn't loneliness. I think I am the third kind. Being alone in the cab is not the same as being lonely. Being alone in a house is sometimes the same as being lonely. The truck solves the problem by making the aloneness productive. A man can be alone in a cab and be somewhere, doing something, contributing something. A man alone in a house is just alone. He wrote that in 1983. I was 10 years old in 1983. My mother was alive. He was in a marriage that, as far as I knew then and still believe now, was a good marriage. They were not unhappy people, my parents. They were suited to each other in the particular way that people are suited when they've been together long enough to have built something that neither of them could have built alone. And yet, in 1983, he wrote, "Being alone in a house is sometimes the same as being lonely." I've thought about that entry more than any other, not because it frightens me. I don't think it was a signal of something wrong, not exactly. I think it was my father being honest with a notebook in a way he wasn't always honest with people, which is what notebooks are for. The loneliness in the house wasn't about my mother, I think. It was about the specific quality of a life that is built correctly and still has spaces in it that nothing quite fills. He'd found one of those spaces. He was naming it. The entries about me are the ones I've read most carefully. Not many of them. He was not the kind of man who filled a logbook with domestic life. But enough. An entry from 1984. Cal asked today if he could ride along on the Beaumont Run. Told him next summer when he's old enough to be useful rather than underfoot. He was not happy about this. I was not sorry for telling him. Next summer I will take him, and he will be useful, and he will remember it. He did take me that summer. I do remember it. An entry from 1986. Cal is 16. He understands trucks in a way that I did not at 16, which means either that I've taught him something or that he has paid attention in a way I didn't, or both. The answer to most questions is probably both. He used that phrase twice. The answer is probably both. I noticed it both times, and I've started noticing when I say it, because I say it too, and I don't know if I got it from him or developed it independently and we converged, which is something that happens between fathers and sons more than either of them usually notices. The last entry, September 3rd, 1987. End of a run. Everything as it should be. Everything as it should be. 8 words. The shortest entry in 9 years of logbook. I've held that sentence for 4 months, and I still don't know if it means what it sounds like it means. That the run was complete, that things were in order, or if it means something else, something about the decision that was 11 days away. Everything as it should be. The run done correctly, the truck properly parked, the logbook entry made. Everything as it should be before the thing that was going to happen, happened. I choose to believe it was both. Because the answer to most questions probably is. He wrote about me. Not extensively. I was a child through most of the logbook years, and the entries about me have the specific brevity of a man who is not going to give the logbook more of his private life than the road itself. But there are moments. A birthday. Cal turned 8 today, which I remembered because I was on a run to Beaumont and came home late. He was awake and waiting. Did not make him feel the coming home late was normal. It is not normal to come home late to a child's birthday. He wrote, "This is a thing I need to do better." And then, "Will do better." He did better. I don't remember the birthday he wrote about. I was 8, and the specific logistics of an 8-year-old's birthday have not survived intact. But I remember that he was there for the important ones, and I remember that when he was absent for something, it mattered to him in a way he expressed through correction rather than apology. The logbook stops in 1987. The last entry is dated September 3rd, which is 11 days before, I now understand, he made the decision to leave the W900 at Bobby Beaumont's property. The last entry reads, "End of a run. Everything as it should be." The entry is shorter than usual, which I noticed when I read it. My father's entries got longer when something was on his mind, and shorter when something was resolved. The shortness of the last entry is the shortness of resolution, not of brevity. He'd decided something. He wasn't going to write about it. 11 days later, the truck was in the field. I want to tell you about the conversation at the kitchen table when I got home, because my wife's response to the story is part of the story. Her name is Karen. We've been married 26 years. She grew up in Center, which means she knew my father since she was a teenager. He was the kind of presence in a small town that you know without necessarily having had many direct conversations, the man who ran a freight operation and was a reliable part of the landscape. She attended his funeral. She helped me go through his papers afterward, the practical work of an estate that 2 people do better than one. She hadn't known about the W900. Nobody had known about the W900 except Bobby Beaumont, who I don't think knew what he had beyond a rusted truck in his field. I came home at 5:30 in the afternoon. She had made dinner, not something elaborate, pasta and a salad, the kind of dinner that says, "I'm here and ready to listen, and I didn't know what you were going to need." I sat at the table, and she put the food down and sat across from me and didn't say anything, which is Karen's version of a question. I told her the whole thing. The box, the logbook, the photograph, the letter. She listened the way she listens, which is completely and with the specific quality of attention that means she's filing things for later as well as responding to them now. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The photograph. The child. Do you know anything more than what the letter says?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Are you going to find out?" I said, "I don't know." She looked at me. Karen has been looking at me for 26 years, and she reads me accurately, which is both the gift and the occasional inconvenience of a long marriage. She said, "Your father left it for you to find, not for you to do something specific with. He left it for you to know." I said, "That's what the letter says." She said, "Do you believe him?" I thought about that for a while. The pasta was getting cold. I ate some of it. I said, "I think he believed it when he wrote it." Whether it's the complete truth, I don't know. He had 32 years to tell me and didn't. She said, "He had 32 years and put it in a truck in a field in Shelby County and hoped you'd find it. I said, yes. She said, that's a very T.C. Tipton way to handle something. It was. It was exactly a T.C. Tipton way to handle something. Not confrontation, not confession, but the deliberate placement of the truth somewhere that the right person would eventually find it at the right moment, with the faith that the right moment would come. He'd trusted the truck with it, because the truck was where he'd understood himself, and he'd trusted me to buy the right truck at the right time, because he knew I was his son, and his sons bought rusted trucks when someone told them they wouldn't. He knew me. That's what I keep arriving at. He put the box in the truck in 1987 when I was 14 years old, and not yet driving, and not yet in the freight business. And he trusted that 36 years later, I would be the kind of man who would buy a rusted W900 on a bet, and take it to Delbert, and not stop until he understood what he had. He knew me before I knew myself. That's what fathers do, the good ones. They see the shape of what you're going to become before you can see it, and they make arrangements accordingly. The photograph is on the shelf in my office, in the hardware store frame. The woman in it has a name. I know it from the letter. And the child has a name. I know that too. What I don't know, and what I'm in the process of deciding whether to know more of, is where those names are now, what they've become in the 40 years since the photograph was taken at the Sabine River bottom in East Texas. That's the decision I haven't made. Not about the truck. The truck I'll figure out. Delbert will tell me what it would take, and I'll do the math and make the call, and the truck will go somewhere, restored or sold or kept as the container of what it already proved it could hold. The decision I haven't made is about the photograph. Jimmy Pruitt called me last week. He said, "You never told me what was in the truck." I said, "It was complicated." He said, "More complicated than the rust?" I said, "Different kind of complicated." He was quiet for a moment. Jimmy Pruitt has known me for 43 years, and he read the quality of that sentence correctly. He said, "Was it a good bet?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Let me know when you figure it out." I said, "You'll be the first call." The East Texas August is doing what East Texas August does. The pines holding the heat, the humidity making everything slightly soft at the edges, the specific smell of a summer that's been running too long and knows it. I've been driving these roads my whole life. I'll be driving them when this summer ends and the fall comes and the light changes through the pine canopy from green to the specific amber that East Texas gets in October, which is different from the amber of the plains and the amber of the mountains and belongs specifically to the light that comes through pine trees when the year is turning. My father drove these roads for 30 years. He drove the W900 on them for 6 of those years, and then he parked it and walked away and sealed what he couldn't say in a wooden box with dovetail joints and hoped that eventually his son would find it. I found it. What I do with the finding is still in process. A good truck tells you the truth. Roll safe.